test to assess the mucosal barrier and immunity. If you guys are ready, drop the word lab into the chat, and we are going to send you a link to join us for tomorrow's webinar, and you are not going to want to miss it. So make sure to drop the word lab into the chat. If you are just joining us, tell us where you are joining from. Reed and I would like to know where you are at today. And if you have any questions for Reed, make sure to drop those in the chat too. He loves to answer your questions. So welcome to the Health Coach Tip Tuesday show, where every week we share tips, tools, and resources for health coaches and professionals so that you can confidently solve your clients' health issues and grow your career as a health coach or professional. I am your co-host and FDN Director of Course Enrollment, Piper Gibson, and you guys know the man next to me. This is Reed Davis, founder of Functional Diagnostic Nutrition. How are you today, Reed?
Fantastic. Thank you, Piper. Good to see you.
You too. I'm glad you're doing well, as always. Reed, before we get started, I just wanted to share a few details about the monthly webinar. If you are a health coach looking to level up, make sure to join Reed tomorrow for his monthly webinar. You are going to gain lots of tips and information, so make sure to drop the word lab into the chat. And with that, let's get the show on the road. In this episode, Reed is going to be teaching about functional lab tests to assess mucosal barrier and immunity. Reed, what kind of testing are health coaches using to assess mucosal barrier and immunity?
Well, you want to use a good functional lab test. You can use two different types. Basically, there's more ways to skin the cat than that, but there are mucosal barrier assessment profiles. For one, there's a good old-fashioned lactulose mannitol challenge. You know, this is a easy test to do. It's you collect a urine sample after drinking some lactulose and mannitol. Now, it's been around forever, and it's actually a measurement of it gives you a view into the topography of the gut itself. So you have to kind of back up and go there to what does it look like inside the small intestines. But you might want to back up just a little bit more and explain what the mucosal barrier is. You know, I mean, I think that's kind of important. It's like your second skin. It's the skin on the inside. It's the nasal carriages. It's all through the esophageal down into the gut, especially the small intestine. That's the area where there's a lot of dysfunction. But it goes all the way down through the the tract, the urinary tract, the vagina, and so on. You know, you've got this mucosal barrier, your second skin, and it's supposed to protect you from things. Like if you get something on your outside skin, you wash it off. Well, you can't really wash off the inside skin, so it needs to be very highly protective, very highly functional, and sometimes it gets less than that for a variety of reasons, and you can test it. One of the things most common is the leaky gut test. Now, leaky gut actually is caused more by the immune system than anything else, and so you can look at the immune markers. But I want to go back now to that idea of just doing a challenge to see if big particles are getting through, and if small particles are getting through that mucosal barrier. And depending on how that looks on the test, you can, and by the way, we'll be looking at this in pretty good detail with a lot of graphics during the webinar tomorrow. So, you know, if large particles, this lactulose molecule, is getting through the gut into the bloodstream so that it can be excreted in the urine, then you've got what's called paracellular uptake, or in between the cells. There's too much space. Now, again, that's more or less the result of the immune system releasing and antibodies fighting this thing called zonulin. So you could look at it that way too. But I like to just see what's going on. Do you actually have physically leaky gut? Not just sort of theoretically, like you've got the immune system working against you, but it's a good old-fashioned test. Easy to do at home. You drink some lactulose. It's a very large molecule. It should not pass through the villi. It might, a little bit gets absorbed anyway, but you shouldn't be excreting a lot of it in your urine. So if you are, then you've got too much uptake. It's called paracellular, in between the cell uptake. That's a leaky gut. So again, the good old-fashioned test. Now, the other part of that test that I really like is further assessment of the mucosal barrier, which includes the villi, the little tiny fingers and the little tiny hairs and the little tiny fingers in your gut. Those can be they can absorb too much or too little of the mannitol. That's a very small molecule that is supposed to get through. So that's a sugar that gets through, but it doesn't metabolize any further. It doesn't break down into glucose like other sugars. So it's going to get excreted. And if you drink a certain amount, a few hours later, you take a leak and you measure, and if there's a whole lot of that in there, then you probably have some damage to the villi. They're too porous. They're absorbing too much of this small molecule sugar. Now, if you have very little recovery of that small molecule sugar, then maybe the villi are blunted. They're damaged. And so what does that do for a health coach? Well, it tells you about something. It tells you something about that person. It tells you there's a pretty good and very strong healing opportunity. Oh, here's something that person needs to, quote unquote, fix. Here's something they need to fix. Again, this is not a medical diagnosis. It's not something that you have to be a physician to look at, to give them a medical diagnosis and prescribe some drug or something like that. No, it's something that's really good test for health coaches to do. It's right in your wheelhouse, right in your backyard. Oh boy, look, something that needs fixing, if you will. Restoring the mucosal barrier is very, very important to the health of a client. And many of them have a dysfunctional mucosal barrier.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite tests. I've done it on myself and I do use it with my clients, but it is one of my favorite tests to just kind of get a better look at what is really going on inside. So it's really a great option, especially for health coaches. One of the things that people will come and say all the time is, well, my labs are normal. So when using lab testing, is there really a normal?
Well, there's normal for you, yeah, but normal for everyone else? No, probably not, because you're going to be a little bit different. What they have on tests are generally considered reference ranges. These are ranges that the lab itself and the regulatory bodies are in agreement about. So these regulatory bodies, and they vary from state to state, come in and they assess the quality of the lab, how well you're running the lab. And they assess everything from, receiving it, the specimen through the mail or through shipping. They start way back upstream and they track every single sample through the whole lab. And then they assess every step of the way. Is there any contamination? Was it kept at the right temperature? And on and on and on and on. Lots of criteria. It would suck to be in the lab business, to tell you the truth, because of regulations. And you know how much we love the government and all that. But these ones just so happens are there to assure quality control. And so one of the things they agree upon is they're looking through now, they get right into the nitty gritty of the numbers, the population, whose samples are being collected from. Again, no test is any better than the quality of the sample that was collected, how it was processed, and things like that. But then they get down to the numbers, and they just agree. Here's a median. In other words, people are 50% above or 50% below in a quote unquote healthy population, one would hope. And so there's a reasonable deviation on each side of the median, and that's considered a reference range. If you're inside there, does that mean you're normal? Absolutely not. It means you're the same as most people. But is it optimum or normal for you is a better question. And the real question is, can you be inside that reference range and still be dysfunctional? Absolutely. I'll give you a great example. Cortisol. Cortisol is measured mostly through saliva for real time, but you can measure it through urine, dried urine, even in the blood, which is relatively useless. But you can get these numbers. They can be in a reference range. And what we care more about as a health coach is function. What does it tell you about the person and how they're functioning? This is why we like cortisol. So cortisol, if you're really stressed out and you have a really good stress response, a good, healthy, normal stress response, that cortisol should probably be pretty high. Why? Well, to protect, in a sense, it's the adaptive nature of the animals to produce some protective hormones and things like that. It will raise your blood sugar. It will assist the other hormones like adrenaline in a fight-flight response. So if it's, let's say, low in the reference range, in the normal, quote-unquote, normal range, but you're under a lot of stress, the question you'd ask is, well, why isn't it higher? So boy, I'm all stressed out. Why isn't my cortisol responding appropriately? And then there's all kinds of ways to break that down to an individual. And I won't want to get into too much detail, but there's an example of how normal isn't normal.
And that's a great example. And I think that that's one of the things that if you really want to dig deep, take the FDN course, really dive in with Reed and learn how to interpret these lab tests and how you can use them to help your clients. You're not going to treat the paper, but you are going to use the test results to really compare and contrast what's going on with your client. So on that note, when looking at test results, what sets FDN apart?
Well, FDN is designed for health coaches and people who just want to find out what's the underlying healing opportunity, what's out of balance, out of whack in an individual. And we care a lot about who that individual is and why they're getting those test results, why those lab reports are showing up the way they are. And they often show a lot of healing opportunities or dysfunction. So that's what we care about. We do not care about medical diagnosis or just treatment options. So I'll give you an example. A lot of people will run a lab, a lot of practitioners will run a lab, and they'll see that a number is high or low in the reference range, or even outside the reference range, either high or low. It's going to be one or the other. And say, oh, look, I found your problem. Your XYZ is too high. Let's give you something to lower it. Well, we call that treating the paper in our world. That's someone else's backyard. The person who's prescribing an agent to raise or lower the numbers on paper, in one sense, treating the paper, don't have that much regard for the variables that got you there. We look at those, and so they're looking for treatment options when they look at the paper. Again, with not as much regard for the variables as a health coach. They would then prescribe an agent, usually drugs or even supplements and things, to get an effect on the numbers, to raise them or lower them. Oh, now I've got you where I want you. So we just, again, call that treating the paper. We look at the high or low number and say, what's wrong? How did you get here? Pretty much you have lived your way into it. Again, we're not talking about viruses and pathogens and things for the most part. We're talking about functional markers. So your question was, what's the difference? And we never treat the paper. We don't do any medical diagnosis. We look at the paper to see what's dysfunctional or out of balance. And then the next step is to go back and say, how did you get here? Pretty much you've lived your way into those test results, and you can live your way back into better function. So, you can eat your way into problems. You can lack of sleep your way into problems. You can over or under exercise your way into problems. You can stress yourself into certain problems, and there's stress is ubiquitous, and there's so many different kinds. And there are other things in the environment that can lead to a lot of trouble. So ours is always just looking at the numbers to get the client to pay attention that this is definitely heading in the wrong direction, and it might end up being later on a medical diagnosis or treatable disease. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever yourself, or do you have any clients who've been to a physician and looked at their test results, say a blood test, and they were told everything looks normal.
Time and time again. That has actually happened to me myself, and I see it time and time again. And it's, they're like, but my doctor says it's normal. And then we go through what you just explained about normal versus not normal. And even though it may be in that lab range, it may not be normal for them.
It could be one of the most common expressions in medicine today. Everything looks normal. So what does that mean? All my problems are in my head? My tiredness, fatigue, my moodiness, my irritability, my sinuses, allergies, just you got aches and pains and all kinds of things, and yet your blood work can look totally normal. So we don't like that word normal.
Yeah, I don't like it either. If you guys are just joining us, make sure to drop the word lab into the chat. Reed is going to be hosting a webinar tomorrow. We would love for you to join him. He is going to really dive deep into all of these topics that deal with all things gut and mucosal barrier. So make sure to drop the word lab into the chat. Melsina says she needs to look at more into one of these tests. So yeah, Melsina, let us know what tests you are looking at there. All right, Reed. I heard you mention a couple of times through our conversation today, functional lab testing. So what's the difference between functional lab testing and just regular old lab testing?
Well, the truth is just about any test could be interpreted functionally, but often they're not. Again, the main difference is you're looking for how well is something working? Is it in balance? That would, as it applies to some holistic lifestyle epigenetic program. A good example would be thyroid testing. So a lot of people have been to the physician and they have certain symptoms. They have tiredness and fatigue and weight they can't lose, and they might feel sad. They might even have like cold or numb extremities. They're probably constipated. There are a number of other traditionally reliable cluster of symptoms that would point the finger, oh, that sounds like thyroid. So then a practitioner might run a thyroid test and pat themselves on the back and say, yep, I found your problem. It's low thyroid. Here's the stuff that's going to get those numbers on the paper back to where they're happy with them, quote unquote normal. Well, again, we call that treating the paper. So if FDN, when you showed up and that was what your doctor had told you, we would say, well, let's look at some other functions that might point the finger at why your thyroid is not putting out what it should be. So if you have hypothyroidism, low thyroid hormone, there's nothing wrong with seeing a doctor and getting a little agent to use to get it back. You'll probably feel better. Symptoms might abate a little bit. But the problem is if you don't address the underlying causes or conditions, which could be a lot of things, then those symptoms are going to come back, sometimes with a vengeance. You end up feeling a lot worse. And then you feel, wow, I don't want to just take more medication. I want to actually figure out what's wrong. And if it isn't that the symptoms come back, new ones appear. So when new symptoms appear, and you go back to the same practitioner who just wrote your prescription the last time, they'll look at that again as what's the cluster of symptoms, what does it point the finger at, and then they'll run maybe a testosterone test or something. And then, oh yeah, I found your problem, it's testosterone, let's give you some of that too. This is how people end up on 3, 4, or 5 medications. They're just ignoring the variables in that person. And again, physicians take on all comers. What are your complaints? Let's run a lab. Maybe they just write the prescription. But they'll run the lab without a lot of regard for the variables. Whereas a health coach cares very much about the variables, like your entire epigenetic profile. Who's this person, and how do they eat, and what's their sleep like, and do they exercise or not, or do they overexercise? What kind of stressors are present? Do they work? Where do they work, and what do they do? And there's just so many variables. How do they look at life? What's your purpose? And so health coaches care very, 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 very much about the variables. And when we're looking at lab work, functional lab work, we are able to individualize, and figure out why your results look like that. And then we recommend or educate the person on how they can turn this around. And there are high level of principles involved in that, which we've talked about on another episode.
Fantastic. Do you have one or two key tips or takeaways you want to share with everybody today before we sign off?
Yeah, that thing we started off with, the mucosal barrier. If you have a weakened mucosal barrier, you're at very high risk today for catching things that are going around that we won't mention. But you're at high risk. So anything having to do with dysfunction puts you at higher risk, not only for catching, epidemic type viruses and stuff like that, but for, as you age, getting older before your time, getting foggy thinking, and you're just tired all the time, you're not sleeping well, and things, and those are all part of the downward spiral, so that you might end up with dementia, Alzheimer's, cognitive, true, real cognitive problems, like you can't remember stuff and things like that. So all the things that are nagging you now, if you don't look at the underlying causes or conditions and reverse it by how you live and nurture yourself, then you're going to be at very high risk for these epidemics and pandemics. That the current one is not the last one. I guarantee you that. And also, let's say you do get immune to that or something like that, to the other problems with decline and poor health as you get older. And I'll say this last thing about this current epidemic or pandemic. It's not really doing a lot of harm to most healthy people. The statistics show that if you're really healthy, if you're already working on all this stuff, then you're going to be in better shape. It's the people whose health has deteriorated to the point where they're already down on the 5-yard line, and this thing can push you over. It can get you over that unwanted goal line. And so you got to be down on the 3 to 5 yard line for it to take you out. So the trick is to not be down there, and exactly what I just said. Start running some functional labs now to get yourself in really good shape. And it's not just the immune system, it's the hormones. The immune system, of course, but it's your digestion, it's your detoxification processes, it's energy production, it's autonomic balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic. You can keep those 6 things in good shape, good working order, if you learn a few things about them and do a few things that are going to have a specific, beneficial, nurturing effect on those things. Then you're going to protect you. It's the only way to protect yourself for what's coming.
Absolutely. And a really good person to help you with that is an FDN health coach.
Don't forget that.
That's right. They're going to help you get it all in balance. So thank you so much, Reed. Always great information. I always learn something, and I know everybody out there always learns something. Make sure you drop the trigger word lab into the chat. We are going to send you the invite for tomorrow's webinar, which is the key to immunity, repairing and restoring the gut. It starts tomorrow at 4:30 Pacific, 7:30 Eastern. So make sure to drop the word lab. Thank you again, Reed, for joining me. We will be back here same time, same place next week. Bye, Reed.
Awesome. Okay,
Thanks.
bye.
Bye, everybody.